Kochman is the executive editor over at Abrams ComicArts, where he's edited the New York Times bestseller Diary of a Wimpy Kid, as well as Art Crumb's Heroes of Blues, Jazz, and Country, and Kirby, King of Comics. Prior to being at Abrams, Charlie was over at DC and Mad Magazine for 12 years. And he's also been a fan of books. He's a graduate of Brooklyn College and just a fantastic human being.
So there's a lot of people here. We thought when we were first talking about this panel, we'd have like 10 people, and it turned out that you told your friends. A lot of people here, so thank you. What's really, really exciting about this is when I first came to Abrams 5 years ago, this was the book that I came to Abrams to do. That, you know, Abrams has been around for 60 years. We do these great art books, but we had never really made the distinction about, well, we had made the distinction between comics arts and fine artists. And what we're trying to do in comic arts is blur that line and say that these are great artists regardless of the medium that they happen to be working in. And Kurtzman was one of my idols growing up, and I think, you know, a short list: Robert Crumb, Art Spiegelman, Hugh Hefner, Gloria Steinem, Terry Gilliam, John Cleese. Those are just the people that you could ramble off that have been influenced by Harvey Kurtzman. Then you have National Lampoon, The Simpsons, John Christopher, Ren and Stimpy, The Daily Show, Saturday Night Live, Airplane, The Zipper Brothers, The Farrelly Brothers, Contemporary Funny or Die.com. These are all things, magazines, TV shows, movies that would not have existed without Harvey Kurtzman. So we're here to celebrate him because he really is, as the New York Times said, one of the most important figures of post-war America, and that isn't hyperbole, which hopefully you'll see at the end. So we're joined here by Denis Kitchen, who wrote this amazing book, and Denis is an underground cartoonist, a writer, editor, publisher. People would know his Kitchen Sink Press. He now has a partnership with Kitchen Linden Associates. He represents the Kurtzman estate, the Eisner estate, Robert Crumb, and given his access to the Kurtzman estate, which we had unprecedented access for this book, the book is as beautiful as it is. In 1986, Kitchen established the nonprofit Comic Book Legal Defense Fund and served as president for its first 18 years. And he's also just a really, really good guy. And then we have Nellie Kurtzman, and Nellie is Harvey Kurtzman's daughter. She majored in theater at Kenyon College, and after graduation worked in theater, film, and television. After a long stint in Los Angeles, she moved back to New York, determined to become more of an adult and segued into publishing. While working her way up in publishing, she continued with creative side projects such as producing short films, art projects for various festivals, and is the founder of Diorama Lounge in Brooklyn. Now, Nellie is currently the marketing director for the Disney Book Group, where she gets to work on many creative projects and talented authors, illustrators, and in fact, cartoonists. So that's the panel. That's why we're here. And I guess we'll start with Denis, because this is the, you know, I guess why does Harvey Kurtzman matter? Why are we here?
Well, I think you summed it up, Charlie, with the long list of influences that you can credit Harvey for or blame him, depending on whether or not you're a fan of some of those things. It's been a cross-generational influence, and it's what I would say is a deep and profound influence. There are people I knew, fellow cartoonists, growing up, getting to know fellow professionals, who were on the verge of worshiping this man because he made such a difference in their life. And for those of a certain generation who were growing up in the 50s, Mad was a truly revolutionary publication. Those of you who picked it up later, when it was a magazine edited by L. Feldstein, it still was a pretty funny magazine, but it was a different magazine. And what Harvey did when he did it in the early and mid-50s really had never been done before. He developed a style of humor that was distinctly Kurtzman-esque, and he went after targets that had not been gone after before. He parodied other comic strips, for example. He parodied advertising, he parodied the mass media in ways that were both funny and revealed deep truths, which is how he defined satire. It's basically finding a target and lampooning it, satirizing it, however you want to call it, in a way that reveals some truth or exposes the hypocrisy about the society. And you got to remember, he was doing this during the Eisenhower era, during the gray flannel suit era, and there was nothing else like it. So those of us who were growing up with it found it an intellectual oasis. And thankfully, his career went beyond Mad. I mean, you can argue and we can maybe discuss whether he should have stuck with Mad or not, but he went on and he had several distinct careers, each with different influences and each with kind of a Midas touch of discovering other talent, or one of his other talents. But the fact that you're here tonight, I mean, I think is an indication that Harvey's still with us.
And I think what's interesting also, you see, like somebody like Kurtzman, when we talk about, Mad Magazine, that's the sort of director of the scene, but he also pioneered and really revolutionized the war comic, Frontline Combat, Two Fisted Tales. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's the whole other thing, and I shouldn't have just focused on that, but he also, again, for those who were reading comic books in the early 50s, war comics were basically ultra-patriotic. The comics done in the Korean War era literally portrayed Koreans with a very yellow ink, big buck teeth, and they're called goops, and they were bayoneted with glee by American soldiers. That was the average war comic was. So Harvey came along, and he basically showed the reality of war. He wasn't unpatriotic, but he basically said, war is a bad thing, and here's why. And he showed how it affected individuals, not just soldiers, how it affected villages, babies, how it was not something you could simplify in just gung-ho manner. And there was a literary quality to his stories, some of which he drew himself, one of which is reprinted in full in this book. Many others he wrote and he laid out, and other brilliant artists illustrated them. But they stand alone in terms of the, I would say, both literary quality and the microscope that he put on, the worst thing humanity does to itself. And this, again, wasn't being done by anyone else at this time. They were the first. And so, in two opposites, war and humor, he created works of genius. That in itself is a pretty unusual combination.
And the books were also meticulously researched. He read letters, he read interviews, and made sure that every aspect of Frontline Combat and Two Fisted Tales were researched and accurate. There was a different kind of realism that was being done in comics, even though it was a cartoonist style.
Right. You have to understand, he was laboring in the pre-digital age. He couldn't Google it. He had to go to the New York Public Library, spend many long hours making sure the uniforms were right. He wanted every epaulette, every button, every medal, every tank tread to be exactly the way it was. When he showed a German tank, it had to be a German tank, not an approximation of a German tank. And so, again, you have to appreciate the fact that he put that effort in because he insisted that it be right. It was important to him. Probably 90% of his readers wouldn't have known the difference if he had done an approximation of the uniform, but it mattered to him.